let's like discuss the situation first, just to have a clear picture of what's going on. First is that what happened is that like Evergrande is a company and they have just too much debt, right? Evergrande borrowed a lot of money and spent a lot of it, right? Like the info slide said that they spent a lot on they own a lot of projects. They've borrowed billions of yuan and spent it on electric cars, football teams. Like generally not necessarily the kind of business or engagements that the Evergrande Group would necessarily be involved in, right? The context here is that the Evergrande Group is a real estate company through and through, right? Like generally, their involvement in the real estate company is like really huge. It can create a huge debt on the economy of the entirety of China, which means then that a lot of the other investments that they've been making generally are just too much risk, and that having too much debt paired with the low tendency for the Chinese people or the rest of the world to invest in properties has also dwindled down, right? So you have a lot of debt, you spent a lot of money on other things, while the main source of your income or the main source that keeps your company afloat aren't working, right? Like people just aren't buying houses. The thing here that is that Evergrande doesn't just rely on their the property side of the business. The entirety of China relies on housing as well, right? But right now, housing is down bad. People just aren't buying properties. So simply put, basically the situation is that this is the Asian version of the 2008 financial crisis. In the United States, it's a lot of banks that made risky investments, while in China, it's basically this one company or one group of companies that made these bad decisions. Like collectively, we call them Evergrande. What are the choices that we have? CCP has two choices, right? First is you bail out Evergrande to reduce the risk and make housing more affordable so that people will start buying houses again. It also means that once you bail them out, it also means that you're preventing some kind of economic like the burning of the world in an economic sense, right? Like people won't lose jobs, or or that small business won't have to shut down because they've been drastically impacted by this, right? This means that basically money will start flowing again. However, the problem with bailing out, and this me like clearing out the counterfactual that opposition has to defend, is that this means that the problem will only worsen because the economy would then still rely on this real estate, or like on the property side of the economy, right? Like China would generally still have to rely on that side of their businesses, right? But the thing here is that China doesn't necessarily want to stay like that, right? So there's some political trade-offs or like discussions right now going on with what the priority of China or the CCP should be. The second choice that they have is not bailing Evergrande out. This means damaging the economy, making businesses suffer because the behavior of investors and creditors will drastically change. And usually, when these kinds of behaviors change, it happens a lot in a very short span of time, right? That's why you see ticks of in stock markets, for example, like dropping down very sharply. Uh, Now let's discuss the first choice and why it's important, and why are we willing to trade off the we're willing to trade off the kind of worsening of the problem of relying towards this specific industry, even if it means that we didn't necessarily solve the problem. It's just a band-aid solution. First is on the economic side, right? I would suggest that we've seen this in the 2008 financial crisis. We've seen this in the dot-com bubble and the 2001 housing crisis in Asia as well, right? It means that when these kinds of things happen, there's no real way to prevent the inevitable. If economies are crashing down and if it's leading towards that, we have to start the discussion of bailing out these companies, even if it's not necessarily the state's fault. Why these things are happening? Like for example, it's not necessarily the fault of the taxpayers of the United States. Why did the 2008 financial crisis happen, right? Or like the reason for that is that there's just poor regulation and that there's past decisions that weren't made in a good way, right? But the thing is that this is generally like CCP's fault in the first place, right? Because they've allowed this huge amount of borrowing to happen in the first place, because in their view, this is how they would want to boost the economy. And now, the kind of housing became a bubble that never seemed to end, right? So people are opting into it and trusting that it wouldn't fall, right? But right now, people aren't buying houses, so like that assumption has fallen, right? So based on like on economic proofs that we've had in the past, this is the only real way in order to prevent some kind of economic downfall. But sure, closing.
Look, if the issue is that there is a housing bubble now, then wouldn't the alternative on opposition be better, that the bubble burst, therefore it's easier for the individual on the ground to purchase housing, as it is largely unaffordable in China as of now?
Yeah, the thing is, housing is like the prices of houses are are going down drastically, to the point that even if it's very very cheap, the way if people would pay for these houses, the sellers of the houses won't really earn any money, and then the loans that they took for them to create those houses won't be paid. So like the economy in that way means that you've basically lost money, and it just burned in thin air, just because the value of that house is drastically lower, right? That's what we don't want to happen. That's why we want to pour in still to these kinds of investments, so that even when people aren't necessarily buying these kinds of properties for a very low price, then these companies would still be able to stay afloat. So like this, like the last thing, the last contribution proves this, right? Is that in terms of strategy, I would argue, like basically the conclusion here is that as long as you get rid of the most urgent problem, then China can open up a lot of different solutions. Like what does it have right now? Like it has technology, it has a lot of industries, like you know conquering the entire world, right? Usually that can only happen if you get rid of the most urgent problem, which is their own economy within their country. Hard to propose.
Okay, thank you, PM. To open the case for opening opposition, leader of opposition, you have the floor.
I'm audible.
Yep.
I prefer to take my POI in the chat box. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The failure of the opening government is that they never really fully mechanized how exactly this would be similar to the 2008 financial crisis. Before that, two alternatives we'd rather have. One, we think that's okay for other companies to buy the share of Evergrande and take over this project if they do think that it is worth that price. Two, we are okay with government provide minimal compensation to homeowner, right? For example, home subsidies to actually subsidize house. Why do we have the fiat? Because number one, if you bail out $300 billion, this is likely to be extremely huge, right? Comparatively, I think the housing prices is very like overly price tag compared to giving people temporary shelter. I think that because given the scale, I think this is okay. Why do we do this? Here's where we actually directly engage with their economic arguments, right? So here's the context. Evergrande's main investment is actually focused on like third tier and fourth tier city. It is betting on the expectation of the expanding middle class of more and more people buying the housing in rural area where they can make it cheaper and they sell it at a higher price. But I think there's a problem here. Several years ago, the CCP realized that one, the housing market is already too expensive. It's difficult for people to buy, probably leading to the potential of the housing market crisis of 2008. But two, a lot of people are using this as a form of investment instead of living, right? This means that they're actively using tactics, for example, like limited buying, right? This means like, for example, you as a household, you can only buy two households. You can only buy several years after. This directly means that overall in the housing market, you're already decreasing the demand and also price of the housing. Therefore, you're actually decreasing the harm of the potential harm of this pricing bubbles, right? Secondly, I think that other developers also exist, right? For example, Yuan have properties in tier 1 cities. Those are likely to have it in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong is where a majority of the value is likely to be, right? These are places with high prices and it's likely to continue with high demand for three reasons. A, because these wealthy individuals from other states, for example, people from like very wealthy able to buy up a apartment in Beijing, for example. You also have FDI. You have like foreign companies have like millions of dollars, billions of dollars, capturing the market of China, trying to buy investment there. And you also have people who are locally wealthy, middle class, right? So I think that what this means is that you're likely to have continued demand for the biggest market economy, right? So therefore, assuming that if we talk about 100% of the market, we think that majority of the market share is probably likely to be located in this big city anyways. I'm not sure why it's likely to be so catastrophic. But the third response is that when you bail out more, when you have to when you have to bail out company, we prefer outside to bail out the most important companies. We prefer to bail out state-owned banks, for example. Why? Number one, because they're likely to be more central to the economy, right? Number one, because they're likely to like loan it to the higher number of businesses instead of Evergrande, who's like having football club, electric car. We think it's even if those football club and electric car go bust, we're completely okay with that. Now I'm going to talk about the comparison. Number one, what is the interest of the CCP? I think that there's a trend that exists, right? For example, they're already regulating companies, right? For example, they're criticizing companies, tech companies like Alibaba, Alipay, Tencent for taking risky loans from bank. They banned celebrities such as Zhao Wei for advancing her club for her fans to take risky loan and buy trust fund. Why is the CCP doing this? Number one, because Evergrande is misusing its leverage. It's using its company and reputation to take up huge loans to fund for future project, right? We think this is likely to be a Ponzi scheme. Why? Because Evergrande, what they do is that they loan money and then they build a housing and then they prepay the supplier. But the supplier is building it by floor. As long as they think that the housing price is not going to high enough, they instantly stop building it, which means that people who buy the housing later on is likely to lose money in that side. We don't want to encourage this to happen. We don't want people to buy the second or third housing in order to make this as a form of investment, right? But I think there's a second reason why they're doing this. There's a first very personal reason for Xi Jinping to do this, right? Xi Jinping's grandest idea is to have like a Marxist society where people have common prosperity, to eliminate the wealth inequality that exists. He's literally having like anti-corruption campaign for several years. And I think that this like housing market, this Chongqing model that for people like Bo Xilai use is exactly the reason why Xi Jinping is likely to target this, right? This means that on the outside of the house, you're likely to have a lot of political support from the top of the party. And we know that China is a one-party state. This means that you're likely to get support out from it. But secondly, I think this is likely to be extremely popular. This is likely to be extremely popular. I'll explain later on. So why does not billing out uniquely fulfill their interest, right? I think that you have a great chance to showcase the determination of CCP on pursuing equality. For example, Xi Jinping's common prosperity, everyone is equal under the same law. I think they really hate like wealthy people continue to get wealthy just because they're able to invest in more housing and therefore make it more unaffordable for other people, right? I think this also solved the housing bubble crisis in mainland China, right? I think that there is a housing bubble that exists because one, people view buying houses as strategic and safe investment and refuse to send it on real economy. What does this mean? Investing in other company that's not real estate market. For example, investing in business loan, for example, making startups, right? This is why this is really bad for the economy when business instead of expanding on the real economy, they are actively expanding it on housing and therefore make housing more expensive. But secondly, there's also a perception that government will always bail them out. Why do we solve this? We send signal to property developer that the government will not always bail you out. It's more meticulous in choosing which land you will buy, which project you as the local government have to accept, given that you are overly relying this on your tax revenue. You are less likely to default because in the future, you have future projects to use. Hence, you're likely to actually complete this project. This is a signal effect to other companies before the NUPOIs.
Yeah. So the gap created by this particular company's departure would be filled in by another big company. Why would not that particular big company cause similar problems that this company caused?
Even in the worst case scenario, I think the comparative was worth it. Why? Because number one, framing. I think as you bail the rich is against the common prosperity. But I think this is overall popular. What is the structural comparative? Number one, you're likely to use inflation money. You're going to print money from central bank. I think printing money to save that is already bad. Given how in China you already have natural disaster, you already have like food pricing, like increasing in like pressure on the food prices. Two, there's literally a electricity crisis in the northeast of China. When you're using this, is going to make people extremely angry and protest against the CCP. This is bad for the politics. But secondly, you have to trade off other projects. For example, like Belt and Road Initiative, sponsoring to other country, the trade war that you're literally having with the United States, that's costing you money, right? But thirdly, China's debt to GDP ratio is almost at the level of 200%. This is likely to be an even bigger systemic risk than saving Evergrande. But fourthly, when you're using housing projects, right, this is overly reliant, right? The moment when you rely this on temporary job, instead of local government investing in companies, investing in technology, investing in innovation, that's likely where you're not going to be able to solve the real economy in the long term. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you, Leader of Opposition. To continue the case for open government, EPM.
Hello. Hello. Just confirming if I'm audible.
Hello, hello.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Starting my timer. Okay. Hi, I'm Kyla. Pronounce her, she or her. POIs, please direct it through voice, preferably after my first layer, but if not, I'll take it anyway. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think I've run 10 debates at the least with an introduction that posits China as a growing economic power that pillaged itself from the depths of agricultural-based poverty, bad economic decisions, into the continuously rising business-rich sector that it is today. So as such, there are two undeniable facts to this motion. First, the CCP, as much as it would only want to focus on their political interests, cannot separate economics from politics. So the market argument in this debate is inherently tied to its political interest, right? So second, in terms of China's economic health and in the international arena and its credibility in the international market, our side will still be infinitely better. So how is this so? First argument, politically speaking, it is in the CCP's interest to bail out private firms using the party's resources because in and of itself, Evergrande Real Estate is a backbone of their economic stability. The reason why economic stability is so important to their political interests will be presented in my analysis. So how is this so? First, real estate agencies like Evergrande is encompassing and expansive. It says right there in the info slide that it owns more than 1,000 projects that span across hundreds of cities in China. This might also mean that in those cities, workers like minimum wage earners and other Chinese companies are co-investing in this firm or profiting in this firm. More so, it says that there is already an incentive of China to protect this firm in the first place because they already borrowed from public funds through the acquisition of loans. So in order to pay back that debt to the government or to the party, there must also be a process of buying out. So in engaging with this process, the CCP mitigates two infinitely important harms. First, it hinders a political economic environment that might be unstable for the party in and of itself. The reason why this is so important is because Evergrande as a specific company is doing a lot for China's economic stability, being expansive as I have already established and being directly related to the state, i.e. state revenue has already invested in it. That's why it's so important. What happens then where there is no economic stability is that the CCP will operate on the ground that is volatile for dissent and questioning from the elite. The reason why this comes from the elite in particular is because the elites are going to be the biggest stakeholders for company to company stability. The nuance here is that when you anger the elite or you anger the people who have the agency and the power to generally make a dent in the party's power or hold of a country, you create a bigger problem than, for example, you just bail out a company and you give them the opportunity to fix themselves. Bailing out doesn't mean that you're going to, later for the POI and through voice, thanks. You give them the opportunity to fix themselves. And also micro individuals that can afford proper housing in a real estate, you invest from the government that makes housing more affordable, something that Lanz already mentioned, so I'm skipping that part. The counterfactual is simple. You get more risks on their side of the house. Not only are the risks that Lanz already mentioned, that the CCP will necessarily trade off, but the party's politico-economic environment that will worsen and be more volatile than it already is. Allocating money for bailing out of a real estate company is better than motivating dissent for a long-ruling party that has an unstable collection of elites that is just waiting for a reason to take back their power from who is ruling. We tell you that Evergrande and its continued collapse when it's not bailed out might be very well that reason. The comparative is twofold. First, by making sure that economic stability is present, you make sure that one of their biggest companies do not die out or do not fail out, and you are not losing a lot of profit. And second, economic stability can also translate to their political stability, something that I've already analyzed in the first part of my speech. The impact then is two. First, the macro impact, which is the economic and political linkages and how the stability of one's economy translates to the safety of its political arena. So if it is in the interest of the CCP to protect its power in China, then it is in the interest of CCP to maintain the stability of its economy. Second, on the micro, the workers, like the middle class workers that the opposition is trying to protect. Again, Evergrande is expansive and it spans a lot, expansive, and it is providing job opportunities to these minimum wage workers. That is why that protecting Evergrande is going to be more important on our side of the house. But before that, POI?
Look, I think the state has limited political and financial capital. The minute that the CCP chooses to bail out Evergrande, it can't implement the same capacity in other areas, right? I think it can use these money to in other areas, for example, just employing these people or to prioritize party interest.
Yeah, but already the status quo is that Evergrande is a big political investment in and of itself already. So by allowing that company to die out, you're also losing a lot of profit. So this is then a debate of profit versus revenue. We say that the allocation of funds to other parts of the economy will necessarily be underdeveloped in the long run. And so moving on, I'm not going to take another POI. Second layer of analysis, it maintains China and Chinese status and credibility in the international setting. The first analysis to this is that they maintain their status as a growing global power. They need to be able to get FDIs and their credibility when they're participating in the international market. This is how they get loans and qualify for higher debt schemes. The reason why this image of stability is so important in their status in the global political economy is that the only way that they're going to get these high debt schemes is that they have to produce an image that their companies are stable and their companies are not going to die out. So for the private companies and Chinese sector similar to Evergrande status to continue existing and continue contributing to China's power, they must bail out the current problem or dent to their reputation, i.e. Evergrande. What ends up happening is that they maintain their growth as an economic superpower and their status in the market is not damaged. The impacts of this is simple. More development projects inside China when these FDIs go inward towards China and their credibility in the international market is protected. This means that more loans, more money to move around for the welfare of their country, etc. And there's more opportunities to go outside of China. Since there is a saturation of the Chinese market, this nuance is important and should not be tossed to the background. So few things that I gave in my speech. First, on the political economic stability of China and the CCP, and thus making this a proper incentive for the bailout. And second, how this would then translate into their credibility in their international arena and their ability to get loans for their development projects. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. DLO, you can continue. In case for opening opposition, start when ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. I would take a POI in the chat, probably from CG. Okay. I want to address a few questions. Number one, is bailout even necessary? I think Donna already responded that in three ways. Number one, we have alternative. For example, giving compensation to please the buyers so that they don't reward or what kind of thing. We have that kind of fiat because we have the equal amount of resources. And I will argue it's relatively cheaper to do that. Second, I think Evergrande is already having discussion with its existing consumer. They're finding a lot of solution. For example, using house to substitute the trust fund payment. I think a lot of things are already working out. Just read at the news. So I don't think bailout is even necessary for CCP to step in the first place. But three, even if Evergrande stops, even if Evergrande can't do that, other companies can do it. Like, I think Donna really proved to you that why majority of the projects that Evergrande is taking care of is happening in second tier and third tier society, which means that it's relatively going to be affordable for other companies to take it out. In case CG tries to say that, now Western countries are going to buy it, untrue, because often especially in the context of China, you have very rigid and strict land ownership tender program, right? Which means that company that are able to buy this land must have some kind of passport or some kind of license that is approved by the federal government. But most importantly, the company, the real estate property, will need to have at least 60% of share held by Chinese. So I don't think it's fair for CG to argue like Western imposition whatsoever. Then CG raised a POI. Wouldn't big companies cause a similar problem? Two responses. Number one, it might be true in the past, but no longer now after the Evergrande crisis because of public perception. Look at the sensational headlines like revolving around the social media, people bombarding the kind of insecurity happen on that, which means that public are more likely to scrutinize the future company that are more likely to take over this project. They're less likely to recklessly buy the trust fund or buy the products offered by the same company, which means that we can significantly reduce the possibility of causing the same problem. But second, I think this company are more likely to care about its PR, right? Because it know that its ancestors Evergrande has done shitty job, which means I'm more likely to scrutinize its ability of doing that instead of just taking out unnecessary risks, right? But thirdly, I think banks or loan giver are more likely to be meticulous in scrutinizing the capability of this company. Just because this company looks big doesn't mean that the company will necessarily have the ability to pay in the future because of Evergrande, right? Which means that you actually encourage more meticulous loan and borrowing this kind of thing. Therefore, we can significantly reduce the risk. The next thing that DPM say is, this is important because we need to give them jobs. Three responses. Number one, look, we are talking about China, so it's a communist country, which means that we have safety net. We have a lot of welfare program offered to public servant or those kind of thing. Even that's not true. We have some local government actively offering some temporary shelter to these people. But second, I don't think housing produce a lot of jobs anyway. There's just exact amount of people that you can employ. Comparatively, I think it's better because if you can liberate this manpower to STEM subjects that this CCP has been constantly doing, for example, focusing on its 5G satellite development, or building this kind of bridges, or sending this Chinese manpower to country like Malaysia for BRI. I think this manpower can be transferred. So I think losing jobs is not contentious here. The next thing that OG assumed is that just because CCP bail you out and suddenly the price will be stabilized and suddenly the money will go back to the market. This is untrue because we tell you that the money that CCP give to the market is more likely to, reiterate or cause the exact same housing bubbles again. Two reasons, right? Because people will always view buying houses as safer compared to spending in real economy, buying shares or buying stock market, because they feel the perception is house is always safer. But second, I think especially in the context of China, when there's a perception that CCP will always bail out, which means people constantly buy house again, right? Which means that the idea that market will go back to the market from OG does not stand, because the nuance is not about average buyer, but about the rich ass buyers or speculators or medium income investor who can actually afford to buy a lot of houses because they expect the CCP will always build them out. Therefore, housing crisis is more likely to exist under the world. Comparatively, we gave you two mechanisms to solve that. Number one, you send signals to property developer, right? Because the fact that CCP will never always build out, which means they're more likely to be meticulous in choosing which land to buy, how the duration of this project that you're going to accept, and what kind of projects to accept, right? Which means you're more likely to take projects within your scope of capability, and by virtue of you taking fewer projects at the same time, which means that you have more concentration and ability to complete this project, which means you have less likelihood to default, right? But second, you send signals to consumer that buying house is not the safe space anymore. You have to invest in other things. You have to invest in real economy or supporting the national policy of China, right? Which means that you can reduce the demand in housing, therefore making the price more affordable. So if this debate is about the affordability of house, I think it clearly wins on that. Now, I think the next thing that OG say is that how you somehow damage investor behavior. Two responses. Number one, I think CCP can afford to, damage investor confidence behavior because they're already doing it, right? Look at how CCP is now banning the privatization of tuition classes, how they're actually breaking up Alipay and Alibaba because they feel they have a lot of big, they are quite big. So even if this action have been scrutinized and be demonized by the New York Times of economists, CCP doesn't really care because CCP has access to how can have access to the narrative, right? It can obviously tell people that this is something justifiable in order to tackle poverty, right? So I don't think CCP really care. Given the fact that CCP oftentimes understand, even if I'm going to damage investor behavior, but it's fine because I still have very unique benefit, right? For example, example, a huge market for investors to tap into intellectual manpower because of Beijing and Tsinghua University, and also like strong technology development like AI and satellite, which means that even if I damage investor behavior, I can afford to do that because the investor will still turn to me given the fact that I'm China, right? But second, I think CCP reputation externally is not good anyway, like trade war, and like look at how Biden and Trump like characterize like CCP. Therefore, the credibility of like CCP is not even contentious. What is contentious now is how internally people build CCP, right? We tell them when you build out Evergrande, you're allowing a lot of like risky behaviors of this company, right? Which means that companies can still continuously doing its Ponzi scam, Ponzi scheme, take out a lot of leverage in taking out loans. For example, like how Alipay have huge access to data, and that CCP is very scared because they are scared about this data being sold to the United States, right? Which means that CCP this is a critical juncture for CCP to utilize this time to actually break these companies out instead of building it out and perpetuate the entire problem, right? But second, when CCP do it, you are literally causing a lot of inflation, which means that it comes at a trade-off for other projects like BRI, Taiwan or Kashmir, right? But thirdly, you damage CCP equality image, right? Look at the Gini report. Look at the rural area wealth inequality. CCP right now is somehow being criticized because of being unequal for only catering to the needs of middle class and also CCP-owned offices, right? CCP needs to change it. It needs to send an image to people that just because Evergrande is big, it doesn't mean that you're too big to fail. In China, this will never happen. Therefore, we are the party that care about the people on the ground. I'm so proud to stand for CCP.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Member of Government, you have the floor. You can start already.
Am I perfectly audible? Hello.
Oh, yes, can hear you.
Awesome. I'll take POIs in the chat. I'll probably take one from opening opposition around 5:30. Let me set my own timer, then I'll start. Okay.
Siddharth, if you have Discord open, just close it. It is giving a lot of sound.
Thank you, Member of Government, Member of Opposition. You can start when you're ready.
Okay. Pronouns are he, him. I would like verbal POIs. So far, the opening house and closing government has been very narrow-minded, making it so the debate is only situated in China. Today, I'm going to explain how bailing out Evergrande is going to impact the world on an extreme global scale. Before moving on to my context and my argument on how there's a huge global impact and how we have better affordable housing in China, I'll be first giving a few rebuttals on their case. Let me first point out that despite pointing out this is not an actor motion, CG literally ran an actor motion, which shows that opening house and CG all have missed the main point of this debate. Moving on, tells us that by bailing out, this shows that China is being trustworthy. On the flip side, this actually shows that the government prioritizes natural interests since Evergrande has a large global influence, and China is just using Evergrande to increase their influence. This backfires on China because this backfires on China, and yeah. Also, note that CG is also very contingent on OG's case. We have two responses for both opening up for both government bench cases. First, they tell us that people lose money, but all replied with alternatives that are better, and you have to engage with it. It is like how it's harmful to bail out. And secondly, talk about FDIs, right? But international companies and industries don't want Chinese influence, so FDIs aren't going to come in the first place. Now moving on to some context. So China under the status quo, they're currently being ostracized by other countries like Austria, like AUKUS, France, for how powerful the CCP has become and the draconian measures it implements. For example, government regulations on the entertainment industry situation in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, right? Furthermore, the CCP has other interests before them. The Belt and Road Initiative, the situation in Xinjiang, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. You have to recognize that there are limited political and financial resources, and the CCP must prioritize what the party cares about first. They favor a capitalist economy, like the stock market, less government intervention, more private intervention. We characterize Evergrande as a company that has a huge global influence, and therefore global interests should be considered in this debate, which opening house and closing government has not considered. Now, moving on to our first argument on how there's a huge global impact. Layer 1, Evergrande right now. Evergrande is part of a lot of sectors as talked about in on the slide. They purchased the country's hugest football team. They have both management, they have manufacturing with electric cars. There's a huge global impact that will result from China building out Evergrande due to its insane global influence. Layer 2, how this affects the global community. The minute China chooses to intervene, it shows that the government has a higher share in the company. It is not in the interest of other nations, and it's not in the interest of China. Even if Evergrande does go bankrupt, only the investors who are going, the only people who are going to lose are the investors. If the CCP chooses to bail out the company, there will be a trade-off in a form of company shares, most likely, or it will come with a condition that is likely to result in greater CCP party influence on the company. With a greater influence on the company, this means that the CCP has a greater say in how the company operates. For example, Huawei, right? The CCP has shares with Huawei. So then it can control to some extent what Huawei does. So with Evergrande being a large company, there's a large global influence that results from this, right? Moving on to layer 3 on why the CCP hegemony is bad. As the CCP gets more control over the world on a global scale, China is able to control even more things, like the economy. They can control trade. They can control the electric car sector. They can control real estate. Furthermore, Western countries don't want China taking over the world, like US, right, or France. It is not in their best interest for China to have a larger global influence, as they could interfere with development. They could interfere with international programs, right? The impact is that Western countries desire hegemony, and they don't want China hegemony, which could possibly hinder their developments. Before moving on, are there any POIs?
Yeah, one from OG.
Sure.
Okay, so bailouts are a country's prerogative, right? In your entire analysis, there's a lack of trying to tie back your main point of how it's related to other countries if the CCP bails out Evergrande in particular.
Like how does other countries have anything to do with the fact that a country like China is bailing out a company that is inherently tied to their country?
Okay, as I contextualized, we already told you that Evergrande has a huge global influence. It controls like real estate, right? It controls like electric cars, as like talked about in the info slide. It has a huge global influence, right? So then this means that if China takes over it, it has shares, which means that it can kind of control what Evergrande is do to some extent, which means that this further expands their global influence. What happens now is that then after they acquire after like they bail this company, this means that they can use Evergrande's global influence to spread their own global influence, right? Now moving on to our second argument on affordable housing in China. Layer one, what does Evergrande have to do with housing? As Audrey talked about, it is mainly a real estate company. They have large control over real estate. Evergrande has the ability to make housing extremely expensive, and they have been doing that right now, restricting the ability for people who need housing to not get housing. Moving on to layer two on how not bailing out benefits housing. After Evergrande breaks up, they no longer have that big of a control over the real estate industry, meaning that housing is most likely lowered since Evergrande doesn't have jurisdiction anymore. The moment the bubble bursts, people can afford land. Opening opposition tells us that it is third and fourth tier cities where people make even less income and need affordable housing. This means that therefore not bailing out also benefits the individuals who acquire adequate housing, right? So basically, if Evergrande doesn't have any more control over real estate, this means that it is very likely for housing prices to drop. It is likely for some government control over real estate or like some share, right? So at the end of the day, it is housing prices is likely going to increase, which benefits the individuals. So in conclusion, why is bailing out bad? It is not in the interest of the CCP. It greatly affects the global economy, and this greatly impacts Western countries as they do not desire Chinese hegemony. They don't want China to take over. And this also not bailing out benefits the individuals as they don't have adequate housing, and by completely taking out the biggest competitor in the industry, we can have housing prices decrease. So proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you. Member of opposition to conclude the CG case, government.
Yeah.
Anshuman,
Okay.
just check your WhatsApp.
Yeah, I'm doing that. Okay, great. I'll be starting and I take POIs in the chat. I'll take one, don't worry about it. I have some opening opposition if possible. So I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, two things become explicitly clear in CG speeches. Firstly, this particular step does not affect the only the market on land, but we think this has a spillover effect on the market or economy at large, because Siddharth explains to you how this spillover effect in and of itself covers the banking sector and the share market and how it causes harm to individuals. But secondly, Siddharth tells you as to how this leads to reduction in labor prices, because of which the minimum wages that people are getting, on which the laws are already so relaxed in China, are going to get far lower, because of which individuals are going to book far more losses and hunger, right? But also, what is this argument coming on CEO that housing prices in and of itself will be low? We think this is symmetric and we can achieve that on our side of the house too. Before that, let's go to the OO impacts, because I will take them on one by one in my speech. Firstly, they talk about whether bailout needs to happen or not. They say that some other company can buy all these kind of stocks. They never give you any incentive as to why any other company would buy failing stocks. It's presumable that no one for that matter would be willing to buy stocks for a company which is already failing, given that there exists no possibility of this company gaining any kind of market share until it gets voter confidence, which it only gets on our side of the house at the point when CCP contributes to the stocks of this particular company. Secondly, we tell you that CCP is the only entity who would have enough money to buy all the shares or a lot of shares of this company so that this company can start growing in the first place, given that CCP has literally the highest capital, for that matter, maybe the second highest capital in the world. But secondly, the Chinese economy in and of itself is particularly stable, just in terms of the exports it has been doing, because of which CCP has enough money in comparison to any other company who has lost money in this particular crisis because of which any other company is not in a position to buy this particular buy the stocks of this company, right? How do bailout occurs then? Bailout occurs mostly in terms of buying stocks of a company so that you can reboost their economic investment. But secondly, in some instances, bailout occurs to like pumping up money, right? We think the Chinese government is unlikely to pump up money just for free without any kind of regulation, so that literally their money does not go to a waste. We think it is likely that the Chinese government is much more likely to buy stocks and create some level of managerial control in order to manage the company or in order to direct the company in the way it is going on. But on second terms, we think that buying a football team or literally buying the shares for electric car in and of itself are not very bad investment, right? These are things which are good prospect. We think these companies most of the times fail because of managerial failure, given that their management in and of itself is run sloppily. We think this is something that would occur in regardless of whichever company comes in. If O assumes that some company would buy out the shares of this particular company, even they can have managerial failure. Their only incentive then is that there will be far more scrutiny from people. We think scrutiny from people have existed for far long time. Even after 2008 crisis, and any company in the world was brought into public scrutiny. However, bailouts for that matter still become necessary, and companies still keep failing because not necessarily they are investing into bad things, but their management in and of itself has been bad. By no means O can ensure that the next company would have good management. But we tell you that investment in and of itself is a risky process. That is to say, at the point when companies invest their money, which they have to do in some manner, sometimes they would fail, given that a crisis like COVID can hit anyways, right? We think these kind of crises are things that cannot be avoided by companies. Most of the times, companies are likely to fail just because either they don't have managerial control or they don't have control over the money flow within the economy, which CCP uniquely has. We tell you in our first constructive that at the point when CPC buys the stock for this particular company, they are far more likely to do better, not only in terms of characterization that CCP in and of itself never takes risk in terms of buying stocks or investing, which other companies are likely to do because other companies have capitalist motives while CCP does not. That means any other company who is going to come is likely to invest in other stocks because of which they have the capacity to fail, but CCP does not, right? The clear impact here is any other company who is going to take such a big share within the market has the capacity to cause all these harms again and again to the market. However, the CCP would not. That means you create larger scale stability on our side of the house by investing some money. The O and CO argument that you don't have money in and of itself is bogus. This is not a country in Africa who have opportunity cost. We think China in and of itself has large scale money which it can invest by any means, but the banks situated within China do have some level of money which the Chinese government can anyways use. The problem then is that at the point when you let this thing occur, at the point when you let this company break down, you are far more likely to suffer losses within your economic consequences at the point when your banking sector and share market is failing, right? This is something that I will go to next, but I will take one from opening operation.
CCP is not as strong as you perceive. It is hurt by trade wars, shrinking budget as deals with military expansion, more incentive to tackle with rural area poverty, and also due to the privatization of tuition classes means that CCP doesn't have that much money as you portray.
CCP still has money to invest in Zimbabwe, giving free vaccines to Zimbabwe, creating large-scale infrastructure in Africa. We think you are telling us some reasons why CCP has lost some money, but that does not mean that the second largest economy within the world has lost all its money. Understand that like bailing out a particular company takes a few billions. The economy within China in and of itself is in hundreds of trillions. We don't necessarily see why CCP in and of itself does not have money, right? But also understand O's whole argument on signaling effect and breaking all other companies is something that only we can achieve. On our side of the house, CCP creates a direct signaling effect at the point when it is able to buy stocks. It is telling the capitalist that at the point when you fail, your stocks will be bought up and your managerial position will be taken away. We think on our side of the house, CCP has a larger capacity to create this kind of incentive because of which there exists less possibility of future market failure. But secondly, on our side of the house, given that CCP is going to take over this particular company, we think all bad practices that O and CO has been talking about, which are followed by real estate companies, which would be followed by any company that comes in next on their side of the house, would not be followed anymore, given that CCP in and of itself has an incentive to do good for the people. But secondly, CCP has to look good so that it does not face large-scale backlash. because of which we think bad practices are likely to stop only on our side of the house, because of which houses in and of itself would not become that expensive like CEO says. We think CCP has an incentive to make the houses cheaper. Let's go on to all the benefits, that all the harms that Siddharth did talk about, just re-explaining them. Firstly, Siddharth told you that it's not only about people losing employment, right? Because OG stops there. We tell you at the point when people lose employment in a large scale, there is larger labor supply within the market. There are more people available to work and less positions available. This means there exists a reduction in labor wages. O tells you that there will be some safety net, but some safety net in and of itself are for minimum security. They never give you anything in your life that you want to spend in terms of self-actualization, in terms of schooling, in terms of healthcare. These are things that you are only able to achieve on our side of the house. People get that kind of protection only when CCP buys the stocks of this particular company, because of which we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. To finish off this debate, opposition whip.
I like my POI in the chat, please. I'll just ask her one probably around the 5-minute mark, preferably from opening. And please don't interrupt me in time of the speech, and prefer gender pronouns for sure. Give me one quick second. I want to note at the top of my speech that this was never an actor motion, right? Therefore, you need to understand that Evergrande as a company isn't just a company that are limited to China. It still has global influence, right? That's where my partner comes in. And this is why closing needs to engage with us, right? I think this is why we have proven to you, why we have proved a better burden and better benefit to everyone within society, right? I think several things in my speech. And firstly, just looking directly at our closing, then moving on to opening government OO, and then back to closing opposition again. I think then first, just looking at closing government, I want to note firstly two things, right? Firstly, I think when you want to note that their case is just largely on their opening government, right? They run the same things and without like really much mechanizing what it means and without responding to the side opposition, right? I think secondly, what they tell us is, okay, we're going to expand this into like non-actor motion, right? However, the problem with then CG is that they just largely grant a case contingent on how China is going to benefit, right? I think several things that they said that. Firstly, that people are going to lose money, right? I think what then you need to respond is what our opening opposition tells us, right? Our opening opposition tells us that alternatives exist, and these are better alternatives because it takes less money to then build an entirety of a company, right? I think secondly, it's just on like foreign direct investment, right? This is what my partner comes from, right? My partner tells you that it's probably less in the interest of China and the global community in the senses that China decides to bail out Evergrande, right? Because you need to note that the minute that China bails out Evergrande, as closing would like to say, that means that the government is constantly buying stakes in the company, right? That means the government has a larger influence over the economy. I think you as a foreign company entering the Chinese market now, you don't want that global influence, right? What that looks like is companies, foreign governments constantly rejecting the influence Huawei has on them, right? You need to understand that in order to engage with how foreign investments are likely to behave, right? I think then thirdly, they just tell us, China has a lot of capital to buy things, right? They have completely misengaged with what's opposition tells us, right? Two layers of response. That firstly, you just need to look at China literally has a lack of capital, right? Well, I will tell you different from our opinion why China has a lack of capital, right? I think firstly, it's just bad BRI investment. Secondly, it's just China has invested a large amount of money on its naval and military power, right? As a Taiwanese, I literally have planes flying over my head every day because of the Chinese intervention, right? I think thirdly, it's just China trying to build like Confucius institution around the world, right? It has tried to spend a lot of money in showing that it's capable, right? I think secondly, that it's not contingent on the practical, right? We tell you on principle, you as a CCP, even if you have the capital, you still shouldn't do it, right? My partner has told you, you still shouldn't do it because the CCP has other priorities, right? That means the CCP wants to prioritize BRI. It wants to prioritize regulations, right? Like it has other priorities and like also the crackdown of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and like Xinjiang, right? So the CCP on principle also has priorities rather than just bailing out on Evergrande, right? I think lastly is just this idea about like managerial error, right? Exactly because the company has a managerial error. I don't see why the Chinese government wants to bail bail out the company, right? Because the minute that the Chinese government chooses to bail out a company that's problematic, I think it sends out the wrong message, right? It sends out the message that I'm willing to bail out a company that's problematic in its functioning. I think it lessens the images of the Chinese government overall. I think then just moving on our opening government, right? I just like to firstly engage with the POI. They ask like, what does China bailing out companies have to do with like global influence, right? They literally at the beginning of their speech tell us that this is similar to the financial crisis in 2008, right? With a company like Evergrande, you can guarantee that there is some international influence. That's why this debate matters outside of just the scope of China, right? I think then what they tell us is this idea of like risk, financial crisis, and fault of the CCP, right? Firstly, you need to understand is just the company itself is problematic, right? It has like, it looks out for fourth tier cities, and it prices housing out of the reach of the individuals on the ground, right? I think therefore housing is largely inaccessible to people who should be benefited from that, right? I think there is also the issue of housing bubble, right? I think closing open government has still yet to reply with that, right? I think secondly, just on this idea of how economic interest is tied to political interest, and there is trust and stability, right? 3-layer of response then. Firstly, as I told you, like CCP has the other party interest. Why is it that the CCP should prioritize this interest, right? I think secondly is just like this idea about like the CCP and wanting to appeal to the rich, right? I think like OG really need to read the news. The CCP is literally trying to crack down on the rich, right? What that looks like is the CCP constantly trying to crack down on the entertainment industry because it's where a large pool of money comes in, right? Where the CCP is trying to constantly crack down on Alibaba, right? So I think like the CCP has less of interest to actually appeal to the rich, right? I think thirdly is just this idea about how Evergrande having a large global interest, right? I think the fact that Evergrande has a large global influence and the fact that the government chooses to intervene, you're going to send out the wrong message because it shows that China is departing from its current agenda, right? China is trying to open up its economy, but I think the minute that you choose to step in with your economy, you're kind of like moving away from what you care about as a party, and therefore it's not aligned with your interests. But before that, any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Okay, I try to engage. Okay, I think moving on to just opening opposition, right? Firstly, just why Evergrande is a problematic company, right? And what OO say, right? I think regardless whether or not Evergrande is a problematic company, we tell you on principle China shouldn't do it, and on practical why it harms, firstly, the citizens, right? I think secondly is how it harms the international community, right? I think secondly is just what opening tells us, this idea about housing market, right? We tell you it's not in the interest of the it's not in the interest, like it's in the interest of the people for the government to not actually bail these people out, right? Because the minute that the government chooses to bail out the company, the housing bubble is going to continue rising and therefore make housing less inaccessible. Okay, so then moving on to the case of closing today, right? We tell you 3 main things. Firstly, just on principle, right? That's not contingent on the practical of why there are limited resources and why the CCP wants to prioritize other things that exist, right? So though that prioritization exists, right? You need to understand that in every debate about the allocation of resources, there is limited resources, regardless of the party or the country you're in, right? I think secondly, it's just this idea about how making housing more comfortable, right? This isn't just in the interest of the Chinese government, but literally in the interest of the Chinese citizens, right? I think the minute that the Evergrande is bailed out, the citizens are likely to be harmed because housing is still going to be predatory at large, right? I think then, therefore, it's in the benefit of the individual citizens the minute that Evergrande isn't bailed, regardless of what the government cares about, right? I think thirdly, just how international community is likely to benefit, right? Because the minute that China chooses to bail out Evergrande, it has a larger influence on Evergrande and therefore even larger influence on just like global economy, right? What you need to understand is that the fall of Evergrande has already impacted other stock markets that exist, therefore on side opposition so proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you, Opposition Whip, and thank you everyone for the round. This is a silent